Catholic History Trek, a podcast exploring the Catholic past.
The eminent historian John Hyam called it the most luxuriant, tenacious tradition of paranoiac agitation in American history. The Harvard historian Arthur Schlesinger Sr. said it was the deepest bias in the history of the American people. 20 years after that, the sociologist priest Andrew Greeley called it an ugly little secret in American history. And unless we believe it's relegated to history, 20 years after that, early in this millennium, Philip Jenkins, another historian, called it the last acceptable prejudice. We're talking about anti-Catholicism, the topic of this episode of Catholic History Trek. I'm Kevin Schmazing, back with my perspicacious partner, Scott Scholze. Thank you for joining us for this episode. In recent decades, historians have paid a lot of attention to the role of anti-Catholicism in the events and movements of American history. They found anti-Catholicism playing a big role in the founding itself, the Mexican War, the settlement of the West, in urban conflict, in the creation of American national identity, even in Protestant church architecture, in the progressive movement, in American intellectual life, in electoral politics, and in popular culture. Now, there are various kinds of anti-Catholicism, and so before we get into the history of it, I want to say a little about what this phenomenon we're talking about means, anti-Catholicism, because it could mean different things to different people. In its broadest sense, I would say anti-Catholicism is any critical or negative opinion of Catholics or the Catholic Church. But a lot of different things could fall under that description. It can include what a lot of us would think of as anti-Catholicism, a kind of raw bigotry, that Catholics are deserving of disdain or hatred simply because they are Catholic. Now, historically, that's probably mostly come from devout Protestants, but also from freethinkers, Freemasons, and that ilk. In more recent times, though, it's my sense, in particular in the American context, that as Protestants and Catholics have increasingly cooperated in the context of an increasingly secular American culture, this kind of anti-Catholicism comes more frequently from atheists or even ex-Catholics. But there's another kind of what might be called anti-Catholicism, which is simply a critique of Catholicism. There are, in fact, very dark episodes in the history of the Church, and these are open to sharp criticism. There are difficult points in Catholic theology. If Catholics consume what is truly the body and blood of Christ, why is that not cannibalism? How is Catholic veneration of Mary not idol worship? There are convoluted questions regarding the interplay of politics, religion, and history. Was the Church excessively friendly with totalitarian regimes? In Spain under Franco, in Germany under Hitler, in Italy under Mussolini? Does church teaching advocate an established church, a state that favors Catholicism to the detriment of other faith traditions or non-believers? If Catholics come to dominate the political regime, will freedom of religion and speech and so forth be preserved? These are legitimate questions, and expressing concern or even criticizing or disagreeing with church teaching doesn't constitute anti-Catholicism of a bigoted kind. Not everything that goes under the term, then, necessarily is irrational or an expression of unthinking prejudice. As this outline suggests, anti-Catholicism is entwined with a lot of other issues. The Protestant-Catholic divide, which has both theological and historical dimensions. Ethnic prejudice, which is really a cultural phenomenon. Political ideology. What do freedom and democracy mean? As we go through this episode of Catholic History Trek, we'll trace anti-Catholicism through American history, from the beginning down to the present. Now, in the American history, I think it's fair to say that anti-Catholicism is a constant presence. And so even though we're hitting the highlights, as it were, we don't mean to suggest that anti-Catholicism was ever completely absent. Even so, I think it's true that there are waves or explosions or outbursts of anti-Catholicism that can be noticed at particular times in American history. and those will be the focus of this episode. Anti-Catholicism in American history begins, well, at the beginning, in the colonial period. Now, the chief rivals of England in North America were the Spanish and the French. And so there was a natural religious rivalry that grew up around this imperial rivalry. At this time, at the time of British colonialism, the British were predisposed to a kind of anti-Catholicism. We've talked in other episodes about some of the history of the English Reformation, Henry VIII, followed by the Catholic Restoration under Mary Tudor, and then the Protestant return under Queen Elizabeth I. The Gunpowder Plot, you can hear all about that in our episode on the plot and Guy Fawkes Day. The threat of the Spanish Armada, the Glorious Revolution. All of these developments gave rise to an identification of English patriotism with anti-Catholicism. That is to say, Catholicism was a threat to the freedom and independence of Great Britain, and English Catholics were suspect in terms of their patriotism. In that environment, a black legend arose. This is English historiography that offers an imbalanced treatment of the record of the Spanish Empire as extraordinarily cruel and oppressive. One key difference, of course, between the English Empire and the Spanish Empire was religious. And so the cruelty, the oppression of the Spanish Empire was tied in English eyes to its religion. The Spanish Inquisition, of course, is one important part of that story. This animus against Catholicism was transferred to the British colonies in America, where it was reinforced by conflicts here in the New World. The English and the French, for example, had a bitter rivalry in New England and also in Canada. There was one place in the British colonies that was a haven for Catholics, and that was the colony of Maryland. Well, it started out that way anyway. Maryland began as an experiment in religious freedom where Catholics and people of other faith traditions were welcomed. But that experiment was terminated when Protestants took over the colony, and Maryland became yet another place within the British Empire where Catholics were discriminated against. In fact, Catholicism, or at least its public practice, was outlawed in most colonies. And Scott has a prime example of one of those instances.
Thanks, Kevin. As my sapient co-host mentioned, Catholicism was outlawed in the 13 colonies. And not just the public worship and practice, but even the mere presence of Catholic ecclesiastics. One such example I wanted to highlight is an act passed in 1700 by the Assembly of His Majesty's Province, Massachusetts Bay. Basically, Massachusetts, just bigger. This order, passed in 1700, expelled all Jesuits, all Catholic seminarians, all Catholic missionaries, and every other form of Catholic ecclesiastical person within the Massachusetts province. Passed on May 29th, it required these priests to leave Massachusetts by September 10th of that same year. Failure to leave Massachusetts would result in perpetual imprisonment, and any layman found harboring a Catholic priest would be fined £200. One interesting aside, the ordinance did provide an exception for priests who were shipwrecked, landing them in Massachusetts not of their own accord. But even if they found their way to the province by an act of God, being shipwrecked, they were still required to leave as soon as possible. But, as Kevin will tell us, this act was not an outlier in the North American continent.
Right. Anti-Catholicism, in fact, remained strong in the American colonies all the way up until the American Revolution. Some historians have argued that it played an important role in the Revolution itself, in the Declaration of Independence from Great Britain. One piece of evidence for that is the Quebec Act, passed in 1774. In that year, British Parliament passed a series of acts which collectively were known in the colonies as the Intolerable Acts. This was one of the stimuli for the Declaration of Independence from Great Britain that the colonies declared shortly thereafter. And one of those acts was the Quebec Act. The Quebec Act involved, as its name suggests, what had been French North America, French Canada. This was an area settled, colonized by the French, obviously imbued with the Catholic religion, and yet recently taken control of by Great Britain at the conclusion of the French and Indian War. And so this Protestant, to some extent anti-Catholic British Empire suddenly had within its confines a large body of Catholic believers with an established Catholic Church. And so Parliament faced the thorny issue of what to do about that, and the Quebec Act was the result. So what the act did was it essentially permitted Catholicism, its practice as it had been in the Quebec colony, also brought it into line with what French Catholics would have been used to under the French state. So, for example, directing tithes from the populace into the Catholic Church to pay for the salaries of clergy. Well, this sort of measure was completely objectionable to the Protestant American colonists a little bit to the south. One example would be the clergyman Joseph Perry of Connecticut, who warned that the colonies would be forced to swap the best religion in the world, by which he meant Puritanism, for the barbarity, trumpery, and superstition of popery. So reaction to the Quebec Act, to the Intolerable Acts more generally, one of the provocations that led to American independence. At the same time, the experience of the Revolution itself somewhat moderated anti-Catholicism and gave the Church a foothold in the new nation. The reasons were at least three. The first, Catholic patriots. Whatever Protestant Americans thought about Catholics, the fact was that many of the Catholics in the colonies fought for the patriot cause, some of them prominently. Foremost among these was Charles Carroll of Carrollton, a prominent Marylander, one of the wealthiest men in the colony, and someone who wrote publicly in favor of independence and against Great Britain. The second phenomenon that led to a lessening of anti-Catholicism in this period was the colony's Catholic allies. If you remember your history of the American Revolution, you know that it's unlikely the Americans would have prevailed against militarily superior Great Britain without the assistance of other allies in the form of the nations of France and Spain. France and Spain, Great Britain's historic enemies, and also devoutly Catholic countries. And so this did its work also to gradually change opinion within the colonies. And finally, the principles of the founding itself. Of course, all of us Americans grew up learning that America is about what? Freedom, right? Well, this was in fact the rhetoric of the founding era. And one dimension of that freedom was religious freedom. And so as American colonists spoke voluminously about the importance of religious freedom, it was natural that they would want to bring the practice in line with the rhetoric. And so Catholics, among other groups, were beneficiaries of that. The unfolding of this development could be seen in the first years of the United States. The First Amendment to the Constitution, which codified religious freedom, including for Catholics, and brought about a gradual end of state church establishments, which is more or less the equivalent of lessening anti-Catholicism, because all of those church establishments were Protestant. In addition, during this early period of American history, most Catholics were genteel, English-speaking, and unobtrusive. So these were Catholics who shared the culture and the language of the British colonies. They were British colonists. They weren't foreigners. They also sought to keep their Catholicism low-key and under wraps. Even though public worship was allowed, they didn't make too big a deal of it. A great example of this is clerical dress. If you look at pictures or read descriptions of what Catholic priests wore in the early years of the American Republic, they essentially dressed like any other American gentleman or American clergyman, not the distinctive Roman collar or cassock. This went for Catholic nuns as well. If you look at pictures of the early Sisters of Charity under Mother Elizabeth, St. Elizabeth Ann Seton, you find that they dressed essentially as other American women would have at the time, not with distinctive full habits that we would find later in American Catholicism and elsewhere. So relations between Protestants and Catholics, or Catholics and the dominant American majority, relatively ironic during the Republican period. But anti-Catholicism never died out completely. And by the 1830s, it was noticeably rising again.
When one thinks of anti-Catholic fiction, passed as nonfiction, something like the Da Vinci Code books from Dan Brown or a host of modern Da Vinci imitators may come to mind, but this genre of anti-Catholic fiction is nothing new. Way back in 1581, Apology by William of Orange was a successful Dutch propaganda tool used to twist the history of the Inquisition held by their Spanish enemies. A distorted history which shaped views on this misunderstood piece of history, which still lingers today. 2 centuries later, in 1729, a book called Master Key to Popery was a popular fictional work by Anthony Gavin, creating a story of a priest who fled the Catholic faith and spilled the beans, as it were, on Rome's supposed moral and doctrinal errors. Essentially a Protestant attempt to push bad theology via fiction and attack strawmen, so maybe like the Left Behind series, modern era, just better written. But perhaps the most successful and longest enduring piece of anti-Catholic fiction is Awful Disclosures, written by Maria Monk in 1836. Similar to these fictional priest tell-all stories like Master Key to Popery, Awful Disclosures was a fictional nun tell-all story. Monk created a tale which she presented as her own personal story as a nun who had entered a convent in Montreal but was appalled by the X-rated indulgences and perversities present in the convent, with nuns, priests, and, well, without going into too many details, just not something you would recommend for children, well, for anyone to read. And in the story, Monk escaped the convent and fled to America. Maria Monk was quickly and rather easily exposed as a fraud, but in an anti-Catholic population, always looking for something anti-Catholic to hang their hats on, they really didn't care. The book went on to become one of the 19th century's most widely read books. And today, this fictional account is still in print. Sadly, Monk's work was not unique in her day, but was part of a larger tell-all literary genre of anti-Catholic novels presented as facts, whether it be priests, nuns, or whoever it may be. Another incident involving nuns, although real nuns in this case, is connected to Lyman Beecher. Beecher was a Presbyterian minister known for being devoutly anti-slavery, anti-alcohol, and anti-Catholic. He served as pastor at several stops in New England before moving to Cincinnati to become president of Lane Theological Seminary. The last stop before heading west to Ohio was in Boston, where he delivered a famous anti-Catholic sermon titled "The Devil and the Pope of Rome." During the 1830s, conflicting reports claimed that either due to this sermon, due to other sermons of his, or due to similar sermons from another anti-Catholic pastor in Boston, of which there would have been plenty, nativists were organized and attacked a nearby Ursuline convent, burning it to the ground. Beecher did not readily take credit for the incident, but claimed his anti-Catholic preaching and the burning of the convent were merely coincidental, but not directly related. Regardless, if the surname Beecher sounds familiar from this era, it was Lyman Beecher's daughter, Harriet Beecher Stowe, who wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, playing in on one of the other aspects of Beecher as being anti-slavery. Staying on the topic of books, even the beloved McGuffey readers couldn't avoid the temptation to dip into anti-Catholic rhetoric. Created by William Holmes McGuffey, who is a teacher at Miami University in Oxford, Ohio, the McGuffey readers were published from 1834 to 1960. These books sold at least 120 million copies as textbooks in American schools and are often associated with the nostalgic one-room schoolhouses and the chalk and slate, as immortalized by Laura Ingalls and the rest of the Little House on the Prairie schoolchildren. As a Calvinist purist, his early McGuffey readers were filled with anti-Catholic lines, such as deriding Catholics as papists and following popery. He even invented the charge that Martin Luther's death filled the Roman Catholic Party with excessive and indecent joy. And while McGuffey's anti-Catholic sentiments were merely insulting, some anti-Catholic books even led to mobs, arson, and murders. In the City of Brotherly Love, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, tensions between Catholics and nativists were running high in the 1840s. Anything that went wrong was quickly blamed on Catholics, such as the burning of a Philadelphia and Reading Railroad bridge in 1842, which was readily blamed on the Irish Catholic immigrants in the city. In 1842, also, the Philadelphia School Board had approved the reading of the King James Version of Bibles in the public schools. And I'll save the point of diving into the many intentional and unintentional translation errors of the King James Version for the Catholic apologists, and the discussion regarding the 7 missing books from the KJV will have to be saved for another Catholic History Trek episode, which will dive into the history of the Bible. But needless to say, Catholics requested that the Catholic public school children be allowed to use Catholic Bibles in place of the King James Version Bibles. And in fact, the Bishop of Philadelphia, Patrick Kenrick, in 1842 stated, "Catholics have not asked that the Bible be excluded from public schools. They've merely desired that their children the liberty of using the Catholic version." The bishop also rejected to Catholic students singing Protestant hymns in schools. And again, he was not requesting that the Protestants stop singing or stop using the King James Version, but merely that the Catholics be allowed a Catholic alternative. The issue remained unresolved, and in 1844, 2 years later, Catholic school director Hugh Clark suggested suspending Bible reading in the public schools until the school board could devise a policy acceptable to both Catholics and Protestants. In response to Catholics asking that Protestantism not be forced upon them and their children, Know-Nothings held aggressive rallies in predominantly Catholic areas of the city, instigating quarrels and starting riots. The results of these Know-Nothing riots were that the Sisters of Charity convent was burned, St. Michael's Catholic Church was burned, St. Augustine Catholic Church was burned, and several Philadelphians ended up dead. A decade later, in Louisville, Kentucky, the Know-Nothings instigated a deadlier riot. On Election Day in 1855, Know-Nothings organized armed mobs to prevent German and Irish Catholics from voting at polling places. These Know-Nothing mobs devolved from a show of force to a use of force, and before long, there were beatings, riots, looting, and arson in Louisville. The mayor of Louisville, John Barbie, himself a Know-Nothing, seeking to save his city from being burned down, actually dissuaded a mob who had set out for the German Catholic parish of St. Martin de Tours. He managed to save the church building and get the Know-Nothings to return back to simply menacing voters at the polls. But that act was an outlier in a day that saw at least 22 citizens killed, including Catholic priest Reverend Carl Boswald, who was killed by a hail of flying stones while visiting a dying parishioner. German immigration was not isolated to just Louisville, as our episode on the land of cross-tip churches will attest to. As America entered the 1850s, Catholic immigration into the United States continued, and the anti-Catholicism continued as well.
So by the time of the Louisville riots that Scott refers to, a wave of anti-Catholicism was well underway in American life. One important impetus is a phenomenon Scott also mentioned, which was immigration, specifically Catholic immigration. By the 1840s, a large number of Irish Catholic and German Catholic immigrants had come into the United States, and they began to change the character of the American Catholic Church. Recall that I mentioned the essentially British or English character of the church, which gave it a common cultural connection to the rest of Americans. By the 1840s, that had begun to change. And Irish and German and other Europeans brought their own cultures and their own customs into the American church. Sometimes they brought different languages. This gave American Catholicism a new flavor as something exotic or foreign, or in the view of some, anti-American. So this growing and more confrontational church began to provoke a wave of anti-Catholic sentiment. A perfect example of this phenomenon was the rise in New York City of the new bishop, John Hughes, appointed in 1842. He was not the learned Englishman John Carroll, the first bishop of Baltimore. He wasn't the cultured French bishops such as Simon Brute of Vincennes, Ambrose Mareschal of Baltimore, or Jean Chevreul of Boston. But instead, he was a combative Irishman with the nickname Dagger John, in part for his pugnacious personality. He objected to reading the Protestant Bible in schools, as Scott discussed earlier. That got him into trouble with New York's Protestants in the 1840s. He began building a new cathedral, the New St. Patrick's, in the 1850s. This would not be the understated structure or the federal architecture of earlier Catholic cathedrals. Instead, he had in mind a brash, big, Gothic church, just like you would see in Europe. In response to this immigration and this newly confrontational Catholic attitude, nativism was on the rise. Scott mentioned the Know-Nothings. Well, the Know-Nothing Party, founded as the American Party in 1844, had as its goal to preserve the Anglo-Protestant character of the United States. And so it opposed immigration, and at the same time, and in particular, Catholic immigration of the Irish and German kind that I just mentioned. One remarkable episode in the history of the Know-Nothings was the affair of the Pope's Stone. In 1848, a group started building a monument in honor of the nation's first president. It's the Washington Monument, the obelisk you can see today when you visit Washington, D.C. The society building the monument soon ran low on funds, and so they solicited donations of building materials, blocks of stone, to build the monument. In October of 1853, a piece of granite arrived from Rome. It was the gift of one of the world's sovereigns, in this case, the sovereign of the Papal States, Pope Pius IX. Well, word got around, and Know-Nothings and other nativists decided that they didn't want a donation from Rome, from the Pope, being a part of the monument marking the first president of the United States. And so on the night of March 5th, 1854, a gang of thugs invaded the construction site, stole the Pope's stone, and dumped it into the Potomac River. No one was ever convicted of the crime, but it was generally understood that it was a group of know-nothings. There's a lot more to this fascinating story, and you can find that in a chapter in my book, which will be coming out in 2022, or maybe in a future episode of Catholic History Trek. After this wave of anti-Catholicism in the 1850s, there was something of a lull as the Civil War drew the nation's attention. Catholics on both sides, North and South, generally speaking, demonstrated loyalty to their side. But anti-Catholicism was, as always, simmering just beneath the surface. And one of the great generals of the Civil War, Ulysses S. Grant, would reveal it again soon.
Civil War general and 18th President of the United States, Ulysses S. Grant, was what some might call a nominal believer, if even that. Grant was not exactly a card-carrying, church-going Christian and strongly supported keeping religion separate from the state. Although what he meant by separating religion from the state wasn't as clear-cut as one may think. He seemed to accept Christianity as the de facto position of the nation and seemed more opposed to favoring various branches or denominations within Christianity. In a famous 1875 speech that Grant delivered in Des Moines, Iowa, Grant avowed that federal government and state governments should support free schools, essentially public schools, but not $1 should be given to sectarian, pagan, or atheistic ones. Since the public schools were basically Protestant schools, he was equivocally arguing for tax money to be used only for the schools which were promoting the Protestant ideals, which was kind of the default American position, while unequivocally denying tax money for any other schools, such as Catholic schools. Grant's position and his Des Moines speech helped set the stage for something called the Blaine Amendment, which I will let Kevin share the details on.
And so followed the second wave of anti-Catholicism, which we can observe in the 1880s. One important aspect of this, as Scott indicated, the Blaine Amendment James Blaine was a Republican congressman from Maine. In 1875, he proposed an amendment to the United States Constitution, which read like this: "No state shall make any law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof." Remember, the First Amendment only applied to the U.S. Congress making law respecting the establishment of religion. And so this amendment would apply that First Amendment principle to all the states. Continuing, "And no money raised by taxation in any state for the support of public schools, or derived from any public fund therefore, nor any public lands devoted thereto, shall ever be under the control of any religious sect, nor shall any money so raised or lands so devoted be divided between religious sects or denominations." Essentially, again, as Scott indicated, prohibiting the use of public tax dollars, of government money, in Catholic schools, or by religious, as the language put it, sects. So the intention was to prevent any government funds going to any religious school. Well, in 1875, that meant pretty much Catholic schools. So this is often seen as an anti-Catholic measure, but in fact, Blaine was trying to diffuse Protestant-Catholic tension. Problem was that government funds could go to public schools that were, in essence, Protestant, and so it ended up being de facto an anti-Catholic measure. In any case, the amendment failed to win the 2/3 in the Senate that it needed, and so was never adopted. But its contents were taken and promoted at the state level, and more than 30 states ended up passing so-called Blaine Amendments. This is still a live issue in American politics in the year 2021, as Blaine Amendments are still on the books in many states. Some have been repealed or watered down, others have not. And some of these make grist for the mill of federal and Supreme Court rulings. Also, around this time, there was a new wave of immigration. The heavy Irish and German immigration were a thing of the past, but there were new immigrant groups coming from places like Italy and Poland and Slovakia. They brought yet new and different languages and customs, and made the Catholic Church in the United States again foreign and exotic to an American Protestant population. With this increasing immigration and natural Catholic increase, Catholics did enjoy growing political clout. The first Catholic mayors of major cities like New York and Boston were elected during this period. William Russell Grace, the first Catholic to be elected the mayor of New York City in 1880, he was Irish-born. Hugh O'Brien, also Irish-born, became in 1884 the first mayor of the city of Boston. This was the historical heart of Puritan America, the place where the convent was burned, as Scott mentioned, and now it was led by an Irish Catholic. In response to these developments, the American Protective Association was formed. It was founded in 1887 in Iowa for the express purpose of curbing Catholic political power. It was nominally tolerant of all creeds, but in its founding document, it stated that it holds that subjection to and support of any ecclesiastical power not created and controlled by American citizens, and which claims equal if not greater sovereignty than the government of the United States of America, is irreconcilable with American citizenship. The APA is therefore opposed to the holding of offices in national, state, or municipal government by any subject or supporter of such ecclesiastical power. So you can see what's going on there. Catholicism isn't mentioned by name, but the idea is that anyone who pays heed to a foreign sovereign, that would be the Pope, must therefore be anti-American or of suspect patriotism. The APA's concern was also linked to the school question that we've already talked about, because the APA held that non-sectarian public schools were the key to American principles, and so opposed Catholics being hired as teachers in them. The APA spread what we would today call fake news, such as a scheme by Pope Leo XIII to prod American Catholics into a massacre of American Protestants, which would occur on St. Ignatius Day in 1893. You see the reference there to another great Protestant bugaboo, the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits, founded by St. Ignatius. The APA was never an extremely influential organization, but it did exert some sway in some localities, affecting electoral results in contests in the 1890s in places such as Buffalo, New York, Toledo, Ohio, and Kansas City. It faded quickly after the turn of the century and was disbanded in 1911. And so this brings in yet another lull in anti-Catholicism in the early 1900s. But you see the pattern here. It never goes away. And yet a third wave of anti-Catholicism, clearly discernible in the 1920s. For some similar reasons, the population of Catholics is growing, both in absolute numbers and as a percentage of the overall American population. And so the political strength of Catholicism continues to grow as well. In this context, we see the resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan as an anti-Catholic organization. The KKK was first organized in the aftermath of the Civil War to resist Reconstruction. It was suppressed by the federal government, but was reborn in 1915 as an anti-Black, anti-Semitic, and anti-Catholic organization, and it exploded in popularity during the 1920s, part of a burst of nativism and anti-Catholicism in that decade.
One outgrowth of these KKK and nativist attacks against Catholicism was the 1922 Compulsory Education Act, passed in the state of Oregon. As an Oregon Klan leader had boldly proclaimed at the time in regards to Catholics, these mongrel hordes must be Americanized. Failing that, deportation is the only remedy. This law attempted to Americanize Catholics by requiring all school-aged children attend only public schools. This law would effectively shut down all Catholic schools and pull all Catholic school-aged children from these schools so they could be indoctrinated in the state-run institutions. Essentially what anti-homeschool laws attempt to do today. A pair of powerful anti-Catholic organizations, the Masonic Grand Lodge of Oregon and the Ku Klux Klan, were influential in sponsoring and supporting the law. After the law passed, Catholic schools, such as those run by the Sisters of the Holy Names of Jesus and Mary, sued the state of Oregon on First Amendment grounds. A lower court ruled in favor of the sisters, and so the state of Oregon appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court in a case that is known as Pierce versus Society of Sisters. The state, who went so far as to call school-aged children in Oregon as the state's children, argued that its interest in overseeing the education of its citizens and future voters overrode the parents' right to choose a provider of their children's education. But in 1925, the justices of the United States Supreme Court upheld the lower court's ruling in a unanimous decision in favor of the Catholic schools. In their decision, Justice James McReynolds wrote, "Parents could direct the upbringing and education of children under their control, and the state had no power to standardize children by forcing them to accept instruction from teachers only, since the child is not a mere creature of the state." Pope Pius XI referenced this Supreme Court decision in his 1929 encyclical Divini Ilius Magistri on Catholic education. In the encyclical, Pius XI wrote about the state forcing children to accept instruction from public teachers and pointed out, as Justice McReynolds had, that the child is not the mere creature of the state. Known more today as a beer-drinking social club that raises money and sells insurance, the Knights of Columbus, of whom I'm a fourth-degree member, have a storied history fighting anti-Catholicism in the United States. And it's actually part of the reason why Blessed Father Michael McGivney started the Knights of Columbus. And while we'll save the story of McGivney and his organization for a future Catholic History Trek episode, the organization did pledge $10,000 to the Pierce versus Society of Sisters court case, and they show up in another incident involving anti-Catholic attacks from the Ku Klux Klan. In 1905, while a student at the University of Florida, John Francis Connolly converted from Episcopal to the Catholic Church, and a decade later, he was ordained a priest in the Diocese of St. Augustine. He served as pastor at Immaculate Conception Parish in Jacksonville, and even wrote a 13-page article responding to anti-Catholicism in Florida, titled "The Present Position of Catholics in Florida," which ran in a 1917 issue of a national Catholic publication called The Catholic Mind. After a few years in Immaculate Conception Parish, he entered the chaplain's corps during World War I. Upon being discharged from the corps in 1919, he was named the pastor of St. Patrick's Catholic Church in Gainesville, Florida, which is also the home of his alma mater, the University of Florida. Albert Murphy, the president of the University of Florida at the time, and a prominent Baptist layman, was encouraging Christian denominations to build student centers and dormitories near the university campus, essentially so the school would not have to incur dormitory construction costs. Father Conley was able to persuade Mary Crane, a wealthy northerner who spent her summers in Gainesville, to donate for a Catholic student center. Mrs. Crane contributed $40,000 for what is now called Crane Hall, which included a dorm and a chapel for the university's Catholic students when it was completed in 1923. Father Conley went on to become the first chaplain for these Catholic students and a prominent figure in Gainesville. That a Catholic priest should be so well received by the community and be allowed to serve the Catholic students at the university brought the ire of the local chapter of the KKK. Pressure was then placed on the school's president to disassociate the priest from the university, culminating with the State Board of Control passing a regulation which banned Roman Catholic clergy, such as Father Conley from the University of Florida, as well as from any other state-supported college campus. But that was not enough, and in 1924, 3 hooded members of the local Klan entered St. Patrick's Rectory and proceeded to abduct, beat, and castrate the priest, before dumping him off on the steps of a Catholic church 30 miles away in Pawtucket, Florida, which I presume that church was St. Monica's, as it's the only Catholic church in that city and would have been known to the KKK since it was one of the oldest Catholic churches in the St. Augustine Diocese. But when the new priest was assigned to fill in for the injured Father Conley, he arrived at the church to find the Knights of Columbus members standing guard at the rectory armed with shotguns. They were there protecting the church from another threat the KKK had made that they were going to come and burn the church down. The Knights of Columbus attack, the KKK's attack on Father Conley, was unfortunately covered up, as the local newspapers did not report the incident, and the police did not bother to investigate it. As for Father Conley himself, he spent 1 year in the hospital and 2 more years recovering in a monastery before accepting an assignment as a priest in the Diocese of Portland, Maine. Another incident involving anti-Catholic violence from the KKK took place well north of Florida, up in South Bend, Indiana, a century before groups like BLM were bussing in protesters and rioters. The KKK was doing the same thing. And in 1924, they sent a large contingent of Klansmen via trains and buses to South Bend, Indiana. And I think this is the part of the podcast where Kevin would expect me to point out that these Klansmen arrived in South Bend riding on trains from the Kankakee Belt of the New York Central System and the Vandalia Line, which had been acquired a few years previously by the Pennsylvania Railroad. But in 1924, South Bend had multiple rails running through the city, and I'm not exactly sure who all the others belong to, so I'll just leave it at that and not say too much else. Regardless, in 1924, South Bend was a strong Catholic area as the home of Notre Dame University. The planned Klan rally held in a Catholic area was meant to send a message and show the Klan's hold on Indiana politics. The stranglehold on Hoosier politics was thanks in large part to what has been estimated as 1/3 of all adult men from Indiana belonged to the Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s. The KKK was used to waltzing into town, parading around in their white robes, burning a cross, and sending a message to locals, and then slipping out without incident. But if that's what these imported Klansmen were expecting in South Bend, it's not exactly what they got. In response to the mass of Klansmen descending upon their city, hundreds of Notre Dame's Catholic students showed up downtown to defend their home, be it proud Catholic students tired of anti-Catholicism or bored college kids looking for something exciting. The Notre Dame students met the uninvited KKK assembly with physical confrontations and skirmishes erupted between the two sides. The students tossed Klansmen into walls and smashed them like they would on the football field, and the KKK retreated to their South Bend headquarters. The next day, the KKK again came out and joined forces with the local police for another round of skirmishes with the students. But after the second day, the Ku Klux Klan had enough, and the members fled South Bend, retreating back to their homes.
Yet another manifestation of this wave of anti-Catholic sentiment in the 1920s was immigration restriction. In 1924, an Immigration Act passed by Congress created quotas for the entry of new immigrants into the United States. Those quotas were based on the percentage of the population currently in the United States. So if 20% of the American population was of British extraction, 20% of new immigrants had to be from Britain as well. This obviously favored old immigrant groups that had been established for some time, especially the British, but also German and Irish, over more recent immigrants such as those from Southern and Eastern Europe, from Italy, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, including Poland. Now, this was not explicitly or maybe even primarily anti-Catholic. After all, it allowed Irish, and it excluded Asians entirely. The target there was the Chinese, who certainly were not predominantly Catholic. But it is an example of the complexity of anti-Catholicism as being tied up with nativism or prejudice against non-Americans, and in this case, Italians in particular. Another opportunity for the expression of anti-Catholicism was the presidential election of 1928. That election saw the first Catholic candidate for a major party in a presidential election. Al Smith, who had been the governor of the state of New York, was the candidate on the Democrat Party ticket. He was running against the Republican Herbert Hoover. A New York attorney, Charles Marshall, raised uncomfortable questions in a widely distributed article in the Atlantic Monthly. This actually appeared before Smith's nomination, but he was the presumed nominee at that point. So the idea was to question Smith's suitability for the presidency. Marshall cited Pope Pius IX's Syllabus of Errors and Leo XIII's Immortale Dei, among other documents, in concluding that the Constitution declared that the United States government would hold in equal favor all religions and no religion, while the popes have declared that the Catholic Church must be favored by the state. And so Marshall asked, is there not here a quandary for that man who is at once a loyal churchman and a loyal citizen? This question of whether a Catholic could be both a good American president and also a good Catholic would be one that would return in the future. In addition, as a Catholic of Irish background, Smith was, in the terms of the day, wet on the question of prohibition. Prohibition of alcohol, a very live issue in the 1920s. The 18th Amendment, banning alcohol in the United States, passed in 1919 and was still on the books during the 1928 election. Smith was opposed to prohibition, as were the vast majority of Catholics. Besides these related issues of nativism and prohibition, there was some bald anti-Catholicism that surfaced during the presidential election. There was, for example, a pamphlet that circulated that said, "For Hoover and America, or for Smith and Rome? Which? Think it over, Americans." When Al Smith went down to defeat in the 1928 election, many attributed it to his Catholicism. It's still an open question exactly how big a role it played, but certainly many Catholics saw it as a slap in the face, a statement that Catholics would never be entirely welcome within the American nation. But the 1930s saw increased Catholic assimilation into American society, and this could be seen in the political realm as well. During the Franklin Roosevelt administration, there were a number of Catholic appointments to important positions, including Joseph Kennedy, the father of the future president, John Fitzgerald Kennedy. Two Catholic priests, Francis Haas and John A. Ryan, served in the Roosevelt administration in various capacities, and Monsignor John Ryan offered prayers at both the second and fourth inauguration ceremonies for President Roosevelt. Many Catholics served during World War II, and thus they were beneficiaries of the GI Bill, which was passed in the wake of that war, which provided college tuition for war veterans, including Catholics. This enabled rapid economic advance among the hitherto predominantly working-class Catholics of the United States and was a boon to Catholic colleges and universities. In 1960, the second American Catholic ran for president, John F. Kennedy, again the Democratic nominee for the position. Kennedy, knowing very well the history of Smith's defeat, decided to confront the issue of religion head-on, and he most famously did so in an address to the Greater Houston Ministerial Association, a society of Protestant ministers, in September of 1960. It's one of the famous speeches in American political history, and we could spend a long time unpacking it, but I'll just read a passage from it and leave you to ponder. Kennedy said that I believe in an America where the separation of church and state is absolute, where no Catholic prelate would tell the president, should he be Catholic, how to act, and no Protestant minister would tell his parishioners for whom to vote, where no church or church school is granted any public funds or political preference, and where no man is denied public office merely because his religion differs from the president who might appoint him or the people who might elect him. I am not the Catholic candidate for president. I am the Democratic Party's candidate for president, who happens also to be a Catholic. John F. Kennedy, of course, unlike Al Smith, went on to victory, became the first Catholic president. With that election, it seemed to some that anti-Catholicism was buried forever. But the pattern continues to hold. It wasn't the case. One critical question in the post-war era was the relationship between the United States and the Vatican. There had been representation, delegations between these two nations since the 19th century, but it had never enjoyed full diplomatic relations, that is to say, at the level of ambassador. President Harry Truman attempted it in 1951, but the resistance was so stiff that he withdrew his nomination, and subsequent presidents avoided the issue, until Ronald Reagan. He appointed William Wilson as ambassador to the Vatican in 1984, and Archbishop Pio Laghi became the apostolic nuncio, or ambassador, to the United States. At that point, there was hardly a peep of protest. So something had changed between the 1950s and the 1980s. On the Supreme Court, the number of Catholics was increasing decade over decade. Today, 6 of the 9 justices are Catholic, far beyond the proportion in the American population. One of those, Clarence Thomas, in a case in the year 2000, wrote that the Blaine Amendment principle, no public funds to Catholic schools. He said this doctrine, born of bigotry, should be buried now. Yet the most recent of these appointees, Amy Coney Barrett, in hearings for her appointment to a federal circuit court, was interrogated by a California senator who worried that Catholicism would play a role in her jurisprudence. So the old concern brought up during the elections of 1928 and 1960. Somewhat awkwardly, the senator said, "The dogma lives loudly in you, and that's of concern."
As Kevin covered the latter half of the 20th century, highlighting John F. Kennedy's presidency, Catholic justices, U.S.-Vatican relations, one might be tempted to think that the United States has become more accepting of Catholicism. But while it could be argued that the country is perhaps more accepting of Catholics, it doesn't seem to have become more accepting of Catholicism. And staying on the topic of judges, in modern American politics, when a federal judge is appointed, it's fairly common during the confirmation process for Republican senators to attack the nominee if they are seen as too liberal, and conversely, for the Democratic senators to attack the nominee if he or she is seen as too constitutional. And these attacks often focus on political ideas and abortion. But in 2018, Senator Kamala Harris used religion to attack a conservative nominee. Brian Buescher, who had been nominated to serve as a federal district judge in Nebraska, during the confirmation process, Harris used Buescher's membership in a Catholic fraternal organization, the aforementioned Knights of Columbus, as a reason to attack his appointment. She questioned whether Buescher knew that the Knights of Columbus opposed abortion, that essentially that they held to Catholic moral teaching. And Harris was essentially indicating that anyone who held to the core tenets of Catholicism was clearly unfit to hold public office. Sadly, this was not a one-off attack against Catholicism from Harris, but when Paul Matty and Peter Phipps were both appointed to positions as U.S. Circuit judges on the U.S. Court of Appeals Third Circuit, they both faced the same line of attacks from Harris, criticizing their membership in a Catholic society which held to Catholic teaching as ground for both them to be unfit to serve as judges. And of course, perhaps the most recent obvious anti-Catholic displays in the United States took place during the summer of 2020, when what could probably be best described as a demonic orgy of hate was spread by BLM and Antifa activists, resulting in over 80 recorded incidents of attacks against Catholic churches in which statues were vandalized and destroyed, churches were broken into, vandalized, spray painted, had windows smashed, signs for Catholic institutions were shot at and smashed, churches were burned and firebombed, and physical attacks were made against Catholics. Even Mother Angelica, best known for founding EWTN, could not escape anti-Catholic bigotry in her lifetime. In 1962, she left the Sancta Clara Monastery of the Poor Clares of Perpetual Adoration in Canton, Ohio, to become the foundress of a new one in the South. And taking an account which I believe I read in her book Mother Angelica, The Remarkable Story of a Nun, Her Nerve, and a Network of Miracles, written by Raymond Arroyo, in this story, after moving to Alabama, someone or some people began to shoot at the nun's convent at night to chase them away, basically chase them back north. If you are familiar with Mother Angelica's story and what she went through in her life, then you'll like to know it's going to take more than some clown shooting at her to dissuade her from her mission.
The historian Philip Jenkins, whom I mentioned way back at the beginning of this episode, argued that the power of anti-Catholicism lies in its infinite adaptability. The point is that Catholicism, because it's a comprehensive worldview, religion, can be tied into all sorts of issues: immigration, abortion, welfare policy, church and state, religious freedom, marriage and family, the list goes on. So anti-Catholicism can be used as one effective tool for whatever agenda is being promoted. Now, that suggests that hatred of the church, strictly speaking, isn't the only and sometimes not even the primary motivation at work. Anti-Catholicism is just being used in a utilitarian fashion to promote some political, cultural, or social cause. But it also shows that anti-Catholicism, be that hostility or suspicion or at least skepticism toward Catholicism, is in fact deeply rooted, widespread, and enduring. Because if it weren't, it couldn't be a useful tool at all. Was Arthur Schlesinger right that anti-Catholicism is the deepest bias in the history of the American people? There's evidence for it. Well, one thing that would make anti-Catholics nervous would be speaking in Latin. But, Scott, I don't think that should stop us, do you?
Of course not.
And so we end in prayer. Gloria Patri et Filio et Spiritui Sancto.
Sicut erat in principio et nunc et semper, et in saecula saeculorum. Amen.
Thank you for listening to Catholic History Trek. You can reach us at catholichistorytrek@gmail.com.